Tonight, get ready for 3 hours of true, spine-tingling stories that will keep you at the edge of your seat, all set to the soothing sounds of rain and distant thunder. If these tales send chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment below. Your support means the world and helps bring even more terrifying stories your way. Now, get cozy, and let's dive into these eerie encounters together. This happened to me about 2 years ago, and even now, I get chills just thinking about it. I was renting a small house in a quiet neighborhood at the time. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was cozy, affordable, and had a lot of character. The only thing I didn't love was the crawl space under the house. The access door to it was in the laundry room, a square wooden hatch flush with the floor. It was locked from the outside, and I never had any reason to open it. I figured it was just pipes, cobwebs, and the usual creepy crawlspace stuff. One evening, I came home late from work. It had been a stressful day, and all I wanted was to shower and collapse into bed. As I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. My laundry room light was on. I was sure I had turned it off that morning, but I chalked it up to being absent-minded in my rush and turned it off again. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was coming from the laundry room, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound. My heart started to race. I debated whether to get up and check or just stay in bed and hope it stopped. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my phone for light and tiptoed to the laundry room. When I opened the door, everything was quiet. But then I saw it. The hatch to the crawlspace was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I distinctly remembered it being locked, and there was no way I could have accidentally opened it. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself it might be an animal that had somehow gotten in. I shut the hatch tightly and placed a heavy box of detergent on top of it before going back to bed. The next day, I called the landlord to ask if there were any pest issues I should know about. He seemed surprised and said no one had reported anything like that before. Still, he promised to send someone over to check it out. That night, I double-checked the hatch and even put a chair on top of it for good measure. I didn't hear any noises, and I started to feel a little silly for being so freaked out. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I froze. My bedroom door doesn't creak unless you push it slowly, and I knew I had closed it before bed. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, as I heard soft footsteps shuffle into the room. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach. The footsteps stopped right next to my bed. I could feel someone's presence, their quiet breathing in the dark. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swung it toward the intruder. There was a man, crouched on the floor, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. He looked just as startled as I was. I screamed and bolted out of the room, running outside to the neighbor's house. I banged on their door until they let me in, and they called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the man still in my house, hiding in the crawlspace. He had a small mattress, some food wrappers, and a collection of random items he must have taken from my house. The lock on the hatch had been tampered with, and from the looks of it, he had been living under my house for at least a few days, maybe longer. The scariest part? The police said they found a notebook with detailed notes about me. He had written down my daily routine, when I left for work, when I came home, even what I wore. There was also a list of plans, though they wouldn't tell me what was on it. I moved out the next week and stayed with friends until I found a new place. To this day, I have no idea how he got in or how long he had been watching me before I noticed something was wrong. To the man in the crawlspace, I never want to cross paths with you again. This happened about 6 years ago. As stated, I was about 12, and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to mess with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness, for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m., we had our camp set up, eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy stuff, guns, girls, etc. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys, who looked to be in their late 20s, wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them, dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kinda hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we had been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake or had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to freak out. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward, what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after wrecking with God knows how much weight in the army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods toward the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good, elevated view of our campsite. I remember, as we were lying there, how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol, an HK USP that he gave to me a few years after this story took place, and was watching the campsite and the surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, about 30 minutes, they had reached it. There were 5 of them and about 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers or campers, nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was terrified. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come toward us, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me land navigation pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down on ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see us from a distance. At this point, I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time, I had a rush of adrenaline and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We lay there for a while longer when, out of nowhere, they started screaming, "Where are you all?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, because of our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back the direction they had come from. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out, my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our things, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back. He then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camping again. Creepy individuals in the woods, let's not meet again, you might get shot next time. Follow up, we never got any definitive information on what happened to the individuals we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy incidents. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly, otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterward, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off? We waited around 30 minutes for him to come back, and he said there were other officers out looking. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would also have to be done on foot. I'm confident I would have become a missing persons case. To better paint the picture, here is a description of myself at the time of this incident. 3 years ago, 5 feet 5 inches, 26-year-old woman, medium-length bleach blonde hair, curvy 175 pounds, wearing black high-waisted tights and a pink crop top. 3 years ago, I was walking home late at night from my friend's house. It was dark, and at the time, I lived in a rough part of a large city. I've had many sketchy situations that I've gotten myself out of, so I guess I felt sort of invincible, like nothing truly scary could happen to me. When I walk alone, I always stay very alert and aware of my surroundings for my own safety, just in case. About halfway home, and roughly 10 minutes from my apartment, I noticed a van started tailing me. I was used to this since, in my city, it's very common for a young woman in a rough area to get propositioned for intimate encounters. It's embarrassing how desensitized to this I was. I did my usual and crossed the road so that I would be walking beside the traffic heading in the other direction. I wasn't scared, just annoyed. The van then turned down a side street, then back onto the road I was on and pulled up to me. At this point, I still wasn't scared. Again, this has happened so many times, and it never mattered if I was wearing something that showed more skin, or if I was wearing a winter coat zipped from just below my chin all the way down to my ankles. That area is notorious for that type of activity. I decided to be firm and told the person sternly, "I'm not interested." I noticed there were 2 men in the van. They looked almost identical and may have been twins or brothers. Both men had a very, very dark complexion, dark eyes, and short dark hair. The van didn't move. I was super annoyed and crossed the road again to get away. At this point, I figured this would be enough for them to stop following me. They didn't. They kept circling back every time I crossed the road. I've never had to put that much effort into getting a creepy person to leave me alone, so this is why I started feeling unsafe. They zipped by me at the speed the traffic was flowing in, and I yelled for them to go away. I thought it finally worked. It had been 3 minutes, and I hadn't seen the van, so I thought I was in the clear. Just in case, I pulled my phone out and was getting ready to call my sister that I lived with. Just then, the van pulled up to me very quickly, and before I could even blink, one of the men jumped out of the van, opened the back door, and approached me quickly in an aggressive manner as if he was about to scoop me up and throw me into the vehicle. The traffic in that area is very inconsistent. It was dead, and I imagine that is what they were waiting for. Just as the man was about to place his hands on me, I tilted my phone and said, "You are being filmed in my live video chat." I gave my friends your license plate number, and the police have been notified. I was so scared, but I didn't let that show. I stayed as calm as I could. The man paused, like he was considering if I was bluffing or telling the truth, so I tilted the phone more as if to give the fake audience a better look at him. He then jumped into the van, and they sped off. I have never been the same since that night. I'm afraid of walking alone now, even in the daytime. Stay safe out there. 2 creeps in a van, let's not ever meet. I hope karma finds you both soon. Strange man gets really creepy when I won't loan him my phone at 3 in the morning. This happened years ago when I was 19. I'm now in my mid-20s, but I still remember this very clearly because of how creeped out I was. Back then, I was living 600 plus miles away from my parents in a different state. Even though there was a distance, my mom and I still talked on the phone at least twice a week, and we were really close. So, when we found out her cancer was back, I didn't think twice about dropping everything to drive down to see her. A plane ticket would have been too expensive, and I had a 10-year-old Toyota that might have been a bit beat up, but still got me from A to B cheaply and quietly. My parents weren't thrilled at the idea of me driving the 11 hours by myself, but my mind was made up. So, they offered me a deal. I would stop at a rest stop every 2 to 3 hours to stretch my legs and call them, and in exchange for this courtesy, they would pay for my gas. If I didn't call within the 3-hour window, though, they would assume I'd been in an accident and call me repeatedly, interrupting the podcast they knew I would have on. I accepted the deal, and that's why I was at this particular rest stop at 2:45 a.m. This was actually one of the nicer stops. Well lit, multiple vending machines that didn't have huge cages around them, the payphone wasn't broken, and it looked clean. There were a couple of cars there with people sleeping in them. I still had 15 minutes before I had to check in with my parents. I got out of my car, stretched, and then almost jumped out of my skin when I heard a man's voice right behind me. "Miss, can I ask you for a favor?" I turned around, and he's leaning against my car. I have no idea how he got there so fast. I didn't see him when I parked, but there he was, uncomfortably close to me. He looked like he was in his 40s. He didn't look dirty or twitchy. He was too close, but his body language didn't scream threatening. Even though I was 19 years old, barely over 5 feet, and at that point in my life, 110 pounds soaking wet, I still felt something wasn't right. And even though I had already binged a lot of true crime media and knew the dangers of a girl my age, alone at night with an out-of-state license plate, my dumb self asked what he needed. He told me that he accidentally locked his keys and his phone in his truck and asked if he could just borrow my phone real quick to call his friend. It would just take a second, and it would really help him out. I almost handed him my phone. I was reaching into my pocket to give it to him with a Pollyanna no problem when I actually looked at his face. Like I said, this rest stop was surprisingly well lit. This guy looked really normal, except for his eyes. He had dead shark eyes. You know what I'm talking about. It's the Ted Bundy, Dick Cheney, actress in a Glade commercial who's trying to convince us she's in love with a dumbass who doesn't know how air freshener works type of eyes. They're smiling, but the eyes are vacant, creepy, and staring way too hard. I got that feeling, that runaway feeling. I knew immediately not to hand this guy my only way to call for help. So, I put on my best customer service smile and told him, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, but I don't have a charger, and I need to save all my battery for the tracking app my parents have on my phone. I need that juice to call my parents, which I actually have to do right now. But good luck." And I turned and walked about 20 feet away. And he didn't leave. He was still just leaning against my car, watching me. And now, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave him alone with my car because he creeped me out, and he had that serial killer look. So, going to the bathroom was out. But I also wanted to get away from him, prove I wasn't going to help, and maybe he'd leave. I could technically get into the car, but I would have to get really close to him unless I crawled over the passenger seat. And he wasn't moving. So, I did the first thing that popped to mind. I called my dad. And my dad, for the first time that night, didn't pick up the phone. When I heard his voicemail, I glanced back. The guy still hadn't moved. He was still just staring at me. So, I faked a phone conversation with my dad. I angled my body so the guy couldn't see that I had hung up the phone, and loudly said that I should be home in about 30 minutes, when, in reality, I was still at least 4 hours away. I mentioned exactly where I was and reassured the fake caller that this was a good rest stop with plenty of lighting and a couple of visible security cameras. The guy still hadn't moved, and I was running out of steam on this fake conversation. In the years since, I've thought of a lot of things I could have said while pretending to talk to my dad, but in that moment, I was beginning to seriously freak out, and my mind went blank. So, I hung up and didn't know what to do. I had hoped the fake phone call would scare him off, but he was still leaning against my car. I stalled for another couple of minutes. I bought cookies from the vending machine. I walked around a little. At this point, he'd been leaning against my car, staring at me, for at least 10 minutes. I honestly debated waking up one of the men sleeping in their parked cars and asking for help. And just the thought of having to wake someone up to help me get into my own car annoyed me enough that I stopped stalling and headed back to my car. I decided that unless he touched me, I was just going to pretend he wasn't there. He waited until I was unlocking my car door before he started talking to me again. He told me again that he really needed to use my phone, that he was stranded here unless he could call his friend to bring the spare keys. He wasn't angry or begging. His voice sounded weirdly friendly, but he'd been creepily watching me for way too long while blocking my exit, so I wasn't falling for it. I almost pointed out the working payphone, just in case I was wrong about this, and I was being rude to a guy who needed help. But then, he leaned forward as I was getting in, and I lost all nerve and slammed and locked the door as fast as possible. He didn't move until I started the car and put it in reverse, and then he finally stepped back and let me pull out. I didn't even have my seatbelt on. I was so focused on getting away from him. And then, halfway out of the rest stop, my mom called me. My mom, who would freak out if I didn't pick up and who was already sick. And I needed to put on my seatbelt. I could still see him in my mirror. He was standing right next to where I was parked, with his back to me. He was far enough away that I felt okay parking again to answer the phone, but I kept my engine running and I kept watching him. I didn't want my mom to worry, so I told her everything was fine, where I was, and my ETA. Now that I was in my locked car, away from him, I was beginning to feel like I had overreacted. She scolded me about speeding, and I tuned her out because the guy was moving now. As my mom lectured me about road safety, I watched the guy cross to a truck, unlock the door, and get in. The keys being locked and no longer seemed to be an issue for him. I watched the truck head back out to the freeway and drive out of sight. I had to pretend to be fine so I wouldn't upset my mom. I didn't get back onto the road for another 20 minutes, and when I did, I didn't speed. I didn't want to see that truck. I found out years later that the closest city to that rest stop had a major problem with human trafficking, and that girls who look like they don't live nearby, or maybe look like they are living out of their cars, tend to be targets. I don't know if that was what was happening, or if he was just trying to scare me into handing over my phone. My brother and I made friends, grateful it ended this way. Last December, I was visiting my family down in Florida, and we spent some time in Treasure Island. My brother and I took my dog down to the beach at about 2 a.m. to play some fetch, drink, and have a good time. If you walk along the water, you can reach a few restaurants, bars, and hotels lining the beach. Out of nowhere, we saw someone walking quickly in our direction from over there, and a few moments later, we could make out that they were being followed. My dog is arguably pretty well trained. We work search and rescue, and I've never once had her run off without permission, nor has she ever failed to instantly return when called. But that changed that night. She was about 5 feet from me, and I saw her hackle shoot up. I went to grab her collar, but she took off in a full sprint, making some truly terrifying barking and growling sounds. We obviously took off after her, and she reached the first person, stopping between them and the people behind them. She was barking, growling, and lunging, and I finally caught up and put her on a leash. She's never reacted in that manner, so it was scary. The group following her ended up being 3 men who were probably in their early 30s. They started booking it in the other direction. I turned around, and the person being followed was a young woman around my age. We asked if she was okay, and she just broke down in tears, collapsing into my brother. My dog insisted she get on the ground for some excited pup kisses and a soaking wet cuddle, which they both seemed to enjoy. She was far too overwhelmed to talk, so she got into her phone and rang her friend's number to have us talk to her. We were able to figure out where she was staying and walked her back to her hotel, where we met up with her friends. We all exchanged numbers to talk at a later time. The next day, we all got together, where we learned she had gone out for a walk on the beach, stopped for a drink at the bar, drank a bit, and then just wasn't feeling right. So, she left the bar and soon noticed 3 men left after her. She had been walking for about a mile at that point, terrified and slowly getting more and more disoriented. She doesn't remember much about the night, and we knew she was probably under the influence of something, but we had no clue she'd been impaired. We're still friends now, and we're all gonna meet up for spring break when we'll all be back in Florida. I've never been more proud of my dog and more grateful that we were in the right place at the right time. I hate thinking about what could have happened. I have been camping, solo backpacking, and hunting my whole life in Oregon and felt comfortable in the woods. I have a deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife, daughter, and 2 German shepherds went camping north of Mt. Jefferson, Oregon. I have included the coordinates of our campsite, which we found to be the perfect setup for us and our 2 dogs. They need privacy, as they can be intimidating to other dog owners and can be loud when spooked. It was not an established campsite, just a nice horseshoe off a USFS road that had flat ground, full trees, and a fire pit. The first night, my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a 2-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away from my wife and my tent. We made the male German shepherd, Guts is his name, sleep with her in the tent. That whole first night, neither my wife nor I could sleep. We both heard footsteps, and they were heavy, nothing like typical forest critters scampering around at night. I was well armed because I had recently read about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his 2 infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had 2 pistols and my rifle with us. The dogs are great at detection, and that's why I felt my daughter could sleep alone, because Guts is completely fearless. Nothing would lay a hand on her without a bow to the death. All in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided were deer or maybe some elk. Day 2. Morning. We went for a walk down the road and, maybe 300 feet away, saw the circle area in the photo. I noticed an abandoned road where a rusted gate post, the gate was missing, was covered in vegetation. Something blue caught my eye, and Guts immediately took off running down this abandoned road. My heart began to race because I thought it was another family camping like us, and he was going to get himself shot or scare some innocent people to death. So, I chased after him as fast as I could, and the rest followed. He stopped 20 feet into the road, and while I was yelling his name, I covered just enough distance to see that there was nobody there, and something was off about the sight. I yelled, "Hello, is anyone there?" "Sorry about the dog." I got no response. My curiosity got the best of me, and I had to see what the site conditions were. As I got closer, I knew something was wrong. It had all the necessities for a campsite, including a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, and a folding table, but every single item had been completely destroyed, smashed and torn from what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around in circles, puzzled why anyone would leave all their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured someone had left in a hurry, and animals got to the rest, as that seemed like the only logical explanation. Still, the propane tank and cooler were flattened by something, and it certainly wasn't snowpack with tree coverage in that spot. As the afternoon rolls in, my daughter and I are playing bocce ball at the campsite, and my wife goes walking maybe 70 feet north to do her business. I do not have a direct line of sight on her, but all of a sudden, I see Guts make a mad dash straight towards her. Normally, he would always be with me unless he is called over, and she didn't call for him. His speed and focus caught my attention, and I knew something weird was happening, so I ran over there. My wife starts jogging toward me, and I immediately draw my pistol. Guts has completely continued running into the forest, another 100 feet, before I called him, and he stopped. My other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to be the pack leader, is not taking point. I have had her for 7 years now, and this was the first time in her life she refused to leave my daughter's side. She was fully hair-raising and attached to us at the hip. Again, any time we hike or play, Leah is up front, bossing everything in her path, pausing to look to see where we are, then continuing. I asked my wife what happened, and she said, "I was trying to pee, and all of a sudden, I felt all my hairs raise. I knew someone was watching me, and then I saw Guts running towards me, and I just got up to move towards you. We spent 10 minutes looking for signs of anything and saw no trails, broken branches, nothing to point to what or where something went. We decided we were spending one more night since it's too late to pack up and drive, but we would all be in the big tent together. Before we go to bed, I put a rope with a makeshift coin alarm around the perimeter of our campsite. I used a mint can, some coins, and keys from our truck, zip-tied it so anything hitting the rope gave a little jingle. Very unsophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. As I go to tie my last corner off at a tree near our tent, our third mystery item unveils itself. It looks like someone has done the same exact thing I have done with a rope that was so old and brown I didn't see it at first. It was broken, and only a few pieces remained, but sure enough, it was tied at roughly the same height, about 8 to 10 inches off the ground, and even had a few rusted washers on it. I immediately felt someone had stayed here before and put the same makeshift warning system on the same tree I am, maybe 10 to 15 years ago based on the condition of the rope. Perhaps my paranoia had now reached a new height, but I had to make sure the girls felt we were safe. At the time, the only thing I could think of was, when the evening came around, I made them sit in the truck, and I fired a clip from my .45 into the dirt as a signal to whatever was out there that we are armed. I reassured the girls that anybody listening to that now knows we have 2 wolves and are armed, and we are too risky of a target, so we can sleep safely. That night, we heard no footsteps, and the dogs never perked up or barked. We left early the next morning. Fast forward to today, and I watched the Amazon Missing 411 Hunted documentary. I noticed the cluster smack dab close to where we camped that weekend, and a flood of dread rushed over me as I thought of that mysterious abandoned campsite with the ripped tent and smashed cooler and cooktop. We have been camping since and have enjoyed the beauty of the NW, but there was something there at that place that possibly took or harmed someone else less than 300 feet away from where we camped, and we all think our lucky stars Guts was doing his thing so well that afternoon. Update: Guts is no longer with us. He has journeyed into the next phase, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him and how he saved us. He was a warrior, and his new brother, Geronimo, has his spirit. Trapped like a caged animal, just waiting to die. In early 2007, I was freshly 18 and newly married, living in Fort Polk, Louisiana, while my husband was training at Fort Benning. I was born and raised in Alaska, so living in the continental U.S. was a vastly new experience for me. My husband had a weekend off, though he was not allowed to leave the base. So, we bought a Greyhound bus ticket for me to visit him and meet the soldiers he had befriended. I had never been on a Greyhound bus before, but I was excited to drive through the South, see new places, and have my own little adventure. Sure, plenty of creeps bothered me on the bus and at the stations, but I still had interesting conversations, met new people, and generally enjoyed the experience. Regardless of the time, each station we stopped at was open and offered food, outlets for charging, and bathrooms. So, when we arrived in Columbus, Georgia, at about 2 a.m., I expected the station to be open. It wasn't. Everyone else who ended their journey there had a ride waiting for them, and suddenly, I was completely alone outside a locked building in the middle of downtown Columbus, in full darkness, and terrified. I didn't know what to do, and my phone was nearly dead from the last long leg of travel. I thought about walking to a gas station, but I had no idea which direction to go, and I couldn't see any nearby lit buildings. I truly expected the station to be open, thinking I would stay there for a bit while my phone charged, have something to eat, and access a phone book to call a cab. All I had was an old sign hanging on the side of the building with incomplete phone numbers for taxi companies. The numbers had faded, been scraped off, and defaced. There was only one complete phone number, handwritten in Sharpie at the top of the list. Better than nothing, right? Wrong. I called the number, and a guy answered, casual and sleepy, asking who I was. I apologized, explaining I was trying to call a cab. The guy perked up immediately and said, "Oh, yeah, that's me. I'm on my way." My phone died 10 minutes after I made the call, and it was another 15 minutes before the guy showed up in a traditional-looking yellow taxi. I noticed the cab wasn't marked, no logo, number, rates, anything, but it had that taxi light thing on the top and, in my young, naive mind, seemed totally legit. He waved me over. I got in and asked him to take me to Fort Benning, finally feeling some relief. The doors auto-locked, and I will never forget the first thing he said to me. He was silent until we got on a main road and said, "Did you really think it was a good idea to call a number written in Sharpie?" I froze. In retrospect, no, it wasn't the best idea I've ever had. But I had so few options and didn't want to be stranded in a huge, unfamiliar city in the middle of the night. I don't know what else I could have done. After a minute, I tried to laugh it off and hoped he didn't notice I was shaking. I reached for my phone before remembering it was dead and realized that if something happened to me, no one would know if I even made it to Georgia. Staring at me in the rearview mirror, the driver told me what was going to happen. "There's no use in getting to Benning this early. The Post Hotel isn't even open. Drive around with me for a while, hang out, and I won't even charge you." I told him, "No, thanks. I really need to get to Fort Benning right away." "Nah," he said. And that was that. We drove to a worn-down apartment complex, where he told me he was picking up a regular to keep me company. I didn't reply. What could I even say? I wasn't raised religious, but I was praying to God for some kind of miracle. Out came a woman who looked a bit like a cliché street worker, tube top, mini skirt, smudged mascara, and an unlit cigarette hanging from her lips. She had short but ready bleached hair, a pockmarked face, and a cheap purse. I had no idea who or what she truly was, but she got in the front passenger seat and lit her cigarette. She turned to look at me. "Don't worry, he's cool, we're cool." That definitely helped. I had never considered jumping from a moving vehicle before, but even if I wanted to, the back doors were child safety locked, and I couldn't open them. Trust me, I tried. I was trapped like a caged animal, just waiting to die. I felt so stupid, so foolish. Sitting in the back seat of the cab, no idea what to do, and no idea what was going to happen to me. I kept trying to rationalize it, downplaying the situation in my mind. I was too afraid and frozen to actually do anything, anyway. As we were driving around, the girl was telling me about the driver, how he was ex-military and had just started this cab business, what a down-to-earth, fun guy he was, and how lucky I was to be picked up by him. How I was cute and young and everything was cool, cool, cool. Her words were a bit slurred, and I knew she was either drunk or high on some substance. I didn't really want to know. We pulled up outside a small blue house some time later, about an hour before the break of dawn, and the driver told the girl to keep an eye on me while he went inside. I was in full-blown panic mode, the suspense of it all making it so much worse, so the girl offered me a cigarette to calm my nerves. I wasn't a smoker, but I said yes. She got out of the cab and opened my door, stumbling a bit before sitting on the curb and lighting another cigarette. She lit mine as I sat next to her, and I started thinking about whether I could outrun her with my heavy backpack, and how long the driver would be inside for. Without me asking, the girl told me the driver was inside showering in preparation. I asked what he would be showering and preparing for, but she just kept repeating how he was cool, how much fun we were going to have, and how cute I was. Then she said, "Ranger cab," because he was, like, a ranger or something. Or maybe that was his dad. He's a good-looking guy. Military muscles. God finally answered my prayer when the girl slumped over and passed out in the grass. I saw the track marks on her arms and guessed it was heroin. And, apparently, the driver was inside taking a shower and wasn't about to come back in the next few moments. I grabbed my backpack and ran like hell. I don't remember exactly what happened after I started running. I know I took off as fast as my feet would carry me and that I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. 1 minute I was sprinting for my life, lungs on fire, and then I was trudging along with tears in my eyes as I walked through the Fort Benning gate with my military spouse ID, asking how to get to the base hotel. Honestly, I wish I knew how I got there. I was in deep survival mode and didn't stop to process any of it until I made it to my room. I don't know if someone gave me a ride, if I followed a map, or what. I've never blocked a memory out like that before, or ever again. I told my husband everything when I finally saw him. He didn't believe me. I probably wouldn't have believed me either. His lack of trust made me think no one would take me seriously, so I never went to the police. I still had the number I dialed saved in my call history. I knew the girl called it the Ranger cab. What I didn't have was the confidence or support to report it. Sometimes I think back to that day and wonder what would have happened if the girl didn't let me out of the cab, if she hadn't passed out on the ground, if the driver never stopped for a shower. It's one mystery I don't need the answer to. In 2017, I moved from Canada to England to gain work and travel experience, as well as to find myself. I ended up living in Essex with 3 other roommates. They were all women, all a bit older than I was. I was 24 at the time, Megan was 31, Cherry was 34, and Cassie was 38. Megan was from New York, Cherry from New Jersey, and Cassie from Poland. All 4 of us shared this 3-story flat. The back of our home was the living room and kitchen, and the back wall was complete glass that looked out into the garden. The garden was completely fenced in. The house had an interesting dynamic, to say the least. There were tons of stories from that time in my life. I adored all my roommates except for Cherry. After living with Cherry for 7 months, I was over her antics. One day, I came home from work, locked the door, made myself something to eat, and went up to bed. I brought some work home with me, so I was in my nightie with all these papers around me and my headphones on, jamming out. I had headphones on because Cherry was out to dinner with work friends, which meant substances, and then soon after that, a tantrum was surely to come. I just didn't want to have to listen to her crazy scream crying. I was working away, completely focused, until I felt something. I looked up to see a man standing over me. I didn't register it right away and passively said, "Cherry's room is on the 2nd floor," and continued to work. Cherry regularly brought strange men home. He didn't leave. Again, I said, "Cherry's room is downstairs." He then interrupted, "I'm not here for Cherry." A cold chill iced my veins, and my fight or flight kicked in just then. I started surveying the situation. I looked him up and down. He had a bottle of Prosecco in one hand and a knife in the other. He was about 5 feet 10 inches, with wild muddy brown hair and black eyes. He was wearing a light blue polo shirt, and one side of his collar was popped up, along with a distinct Manchester accent. Once I focused, I realized his eyes were black because his pupils were completely dilated. Shit, I was in trouble. I needed an escape plan. Unfortunately, this man was standing in between me and my bedroom door. I needed to get downstairs, but I needed him to think it was his idea. I decided to play along. Just then, he used his knife to pop the cork, and Prosecco started flowing onto my carpet. I said, "Oh no! Let's clean that up." I prefer to drink out of a proper flute anyway. He nodded, replying, "Yeah, you're a proper classy bird." Let's go. I tried to act as naturally as possible, tried not to show that I was shaking all over, and tried to gain control over my breathing. We took the long journey down to the main floor of my flat, all 3 floors. He had the back of my knife bunched up in one hand, and I could feel the point of the knife graze my back with his other. I was trying to playfully speak with him as we walked down the stairs. I couldn't tell you what I was saying. I was most likely rambling. I couldn't hear anything over my heart beating in my ears. We get to the bottom of the stairs, and there is a hallway to my left that leads to the front door. On my right, which is much closer to us, is the kitchen and living room. We make our way into the kitchen. I point to the cabinets that had the wine glasses. He says he knows where they are and starts toward them. I now have the kitchen table in between us, and it's time to run. I burst into a sprint down the hallway toward the door. My hands fumble over the locks, shaking and sweating. I swing open the door and see 2 men walking across the street. They must have been walking home from the train. There was a big train station in front of our home. I call out to them for help, and suddenly I am flung onto the ground. Little pebbles piercing my skin send sharp pains where they jab. The intruder pushes me out of the way to run and escape. One of the men chases after the intruder, while the other tells me to go inside while he surveys my home and to call the police. I lock the doors and call the police. While I'm on the phone with dispatch, I frantically run around the house to double-check all the windows and doors. Suddenly, I hear a loud bang on my door. I inform dispatch of the banging, and she informs me that the police aren't there yet. I think it might be one of the gentlemen who helped me. I go to look through the peephole, and it's him. The intruder. He came back. He's banging on my door, screaming that I have his glasses and that he's not done with me. I absolutely freak out. The dispatcher attempts to calm me down, but I am losing my mind. She then says, "They are pulling onto your street now. You should hear their sirens." I do. Thank God. The intruder then takes off, and one officer jumps out of the passenger side while the car is still moving and chases after him. The second officer comes into my home, interviews me and the 2 gentlemen, collects evidence, and takes photos. After some time, Cherry comes home and freaks out. Once this situation is explained to her, she says, "Oh my God, that could have been me." "Yeah, thanks, Cherry. It's all about you." The next morning, I am called in to identify a man they had in custody. I point him out. I go into a little room, and the officer pulls out an evidence bag. He asks me if the items are mine. They are. There are my underwear and photos taken from my home. The officer informs me that the intruder had been stalking me for some time now. He estimates 3 months. He had made a nest outside our home, on top of a hill that overlooked our living room and kitchen. He is a known substance dealer. He then tells me how lucky I was to get out practically unharmed. Others weren't so lucky. To the man who stalked me and broke into my home, let's not meet again. However, I would love to run into those 2 gentlemen again. Every day, I am thankful for them. The handyman was too hands-on, so I hurt him. As a little background for this story, I'm 17, female, and Australian. I'm often the only one home in the afternoons since my father works away a lot and my mother works late at night. Luckily, I have my lovely dog keeping me company. We rent our house, and it is very old, which shows. When we first moved in, my parents made a complaint to the realtors that the kitchen was falling apart, and they said they would send someone over. A month later, at about 2 p.m., there was a knock on the door, and a man told me he was here to take a look at the kitchen. He said he had tried to call both my parents, but neither had answered. He appeared to be in his 40s and seemed to have an Italian accent, but he spoke English very well, so I understood him fine. I unlocked the screen door and allowed him in while trying to hold onto the dog's collar as she was losing her mind. The handyman came in and told me his name, which I've since forgotten. He then asked for mine, and I told him. He asked what I was doing home so early, and I explained that sometimes my classes at school finished earlier than most, which is why I was at home. Something about him made my hair stand on end, but I ignored it, blaming it on just being tired and paranoid. He went and poked around the kitchen, measuring and doing the usual stuff, then left. When my parents came home, I told them about him, and they said neither of their phones had missed calls. We all shrugged it off, deciding maybe he had the wrong numbers or something, but I did tell my mom that he creeped me out, and she told me to be careful around him if they weren't home. A couple of months later, more things broke, and my parents again contacted the real estate. The handyman came again twice when I was alone, and he had the same story about my parents not answering the phone. I let him in since I had my dog and wanted to get the things fixed. He still made my skin crawl, so I tended to go into my room with the dog and call my best friend, talking to her while he worked. He was scared of the dog, and on the third time he came to the house, he must not have realized that she was in my room with me. He tried to force the door open. The doors in this house are original and have strange locks that even I can force open if I want to, so he easily got it after about a minute. My dog threw herself off my bed and at him, and I just grabbed her before she could bite. I was in shock because she had never tried to really hurt anyone, and some guy just forced open my door. He told me that he had finished the work and wanted me to know, so that's why he opened it, because he just couldn't knock, right? I told him that he should leave in a tone that was way calmer than I felt, and off he went. I called my dad, and he told me never to let him back in if I was on my own. The fourth time he came, my mom was home with me, and he spoke to her in an accent that I believe had to be Turkish, and you could barely understand a word. Since my mom was home, I stayed with her as she talked to him. A door in our house leading to the back garden often gets badly stuck, but on that day, we thought my dad had locked it on his way out, as he sometimes does. The handyman somehow got it open, and we assumed that it must have been stuck after all. He made both my mother and me extremely uncomfortable as he stared at me the entire time. She then refused to answer the door and told me to never answer it again if it was the handyman. My dad would be dealing with all interactions from then on. That was the last time I saw him for about 8 months, until 2 months ago. My dog was at the groomer, and as usual, I was home alone. I was in the kitchen starting dinner, as it was about 6 p.m. and the sun was almost gone. There was a loud cry from the timber floors behind me that I ignored, as they often made noises when my dog was walking about. I can honestly tell you that it was the most horrific moment of realization for me when I remembered that my dog wasn't here and that there was someone behind me. I tightened my grip on the massive knife that I'd been using to cut up some onion and whipped around. The handyman was there with the sickest smile on his face and a hammer in his hand. I yelled at him to get out before I called the cops and held up the knife. I was shaking. He stepped forward. I went to run past him, but he grabbed me by the hair, and in a struggle, I sliced his face open and kneed him where it really hurts. While he was in shock and or agony, I ran into my bedroom, which is right next door to the kitchen, and slammed the door shut, locked it, grabbed my phone, and forced the windows behind my bed open. I jumped onto the rotting roof of the deck, which was attached to the outside wall directly below my window. The handyman was bashing on the door and made it in just as I jumped down onto the concrete and took off running across the street to a neighboring house. I called emergency services, crying and telling the operator what happened and that I needed the police. I banged on the neighbor's door, begging to be let in, but no one was home, so I ran to another house with the operator still on the phone, asking for details. This neighbor was home, but before she could even open the door, I heard police sirens hurtling down the street and ran to the officers the second they stepped out of the car. A report was made, My parents were called, the media turned up, the knife was taken from me for DNA evidence, and the house was searched for him, any evidence.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I found an unmarked pill bottle with my name on it in my work bag. It was an ordinary morning and I was preparing for a day filled with meetings and tasks. I had been so busy lately that I hadn't thought much about the contents of my bag. When I grabbed the bottle, it caught me off guard, and for a moment, I wondered where it had come from. At first, I assumed that I must have placed it there myself at some point. But as I examined it more closely, I realized that the bottle was unmarked. There was no label indicating what it was or who had given it to me. The sight of it made my heart race for a moment, unsure of whether I should be worried or if it was simply a mistake. I tried to recall whether I had filled a prescription recently or if someone had given me the bottle without any explanation. However, nothing seemed to click in my memory. It didn't help that I had been juggling multiple projects at work, and I often found myself distracted. The thought of taking an unfamiliar pill bottle to a doctor for confirmation crossed my mind, but I hesitated, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing on me. After sitting with the bottle in my hand for a few moments, I realized that I needed to think this through more clearly. I knew I could call my pharmacy to see if they had any record of such a prescription, but that didn't seem like enough. Something about the lack of a label made me uneasy. It wasn't like I could simply walk into a doctor's office and ask if this pill was safe to take. There were so many questions swirling around in my head. What was inside the bottle? Was it something that had been misplaced or forgotten? Or was it something more sinister? I immediately thought of all the stories I had heard about medication mix-ups and the potential dangers of taking unknown substances. I decided to take a more careful approach. Instead of jumping to conclusions, I would try to trace the bottle's origin. Maybe it was a sample from a previous doctor's visit, or perhaps it was something I had forgotten about from my last medical checkup. The more I thought about it, the more uncertain I became. The idea of taking the bottle to a pharmacy seemed like a logical step. They could confirm what the pill was and whether it was meant for me. However, I felt a bit embarrassed bringing in a bottle that didn't even have a proper label. I wondered how I would explain it to the pharmacist without sounding foolish. In the meantime, I set the bottle aside, not wanting to make any hasty decisions. I needed time to think. I wasn't one to panic, but the mystery surrounding the bottle was too great to ignore. I felt a growing sense of responsibility to make sure I wasn't doing something reckless, even though I had no idea what the pill was. I considered the possibility that someone at work had slipped the bottle into my bag as a joke, but I quickly dismissed that idea. Who would do something like that? It didn't make sense. I had never known anyone at work to act in such a manner, and the whole situation felt too serious for a prank. The more I analyzed it, the more I realized that the only responsible action was to get answers. The uncertainty of the situation was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be sure about what I was dealing with. I briefly thought about simply throwing the bottle away, but that didn't seem like the right thing to do either. A quick call to my doctor's office seemed like the best option. After all, they would have a record of any prescriptions they had written for me. I tried to recall whether I had filled any prescriptions recently, but nothing came to mind. This added to the mystery of it all. I dialed the number for the doctor's office, hoping for some clarity. After a few rings, the receptionist answered. I explained the situation, telling her about the unmarked bottle with my name on it. She seemed just as confused as I was, and she assured me that she would check the records to see if any prescriptions matched the description. While I waited for her response, I couldn't help but feel anxious. What if it was something dangerous? What if the bottle had been tampered with? These questions kept swirling around in my head as I anxiously awaited the call back from the doctor's office. After what seemed like an eternity, the receptionist finally returned my call. She informed me that they had no record of any recent prescriptions under my name that matched the pill bottle I had described. The news only deepened my sense of unease. If the bottle wasn't from the doctor, then where could it have come from? I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. The lack of any concrete answers made me feel more lost than ever. There was still a part of me that hoped there was some simple explanation, but the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. I realized I had no choice but to take further action to ensure my safety. The next step was to call my local pharmacy. I figured they would have a record of any medications I had filled recently, and they could tell me whether this bottle had been dispensed by them. If the bottle had come from the pharmacy, then at least I would have some peace of mind knowing it was something I was supposed to have. When I called the pharmacy, I explained the situation to the pharmacist. I described the pill bottle and my concerns about its origin. The pharmacist asked for my name and information to check their records. I waited anxiously for their response, hoping for any clue that would help me make sense of this mystery. The pharmacist soon returned with the answer I had been dreading. They confirmed that they had no record of filling any prescriptions for me that matched the description of the pill bottle I had found. It was becoming clear that this bottle did not belong to me, and I couldn't help but wonder how it had ended up in my bag. I was left with no choice but to bring the bottle to the authorities. I contacted the local police department and explained the situation. They told me to come in and bring the bottle for examination. It was the only way to ensure that the contents of the bottle were safe and to determine whether there was any foul play involved. As I drove to the police station, my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about all the possibilities. What if the bottle had been tampered with? What if it was some kind of dangerous substance? I told myself not to panic and that I was doing the right thing, but the uncertainty was starting to weigh on me heavily. Upon arriving at the police station, I handed the bottle over to the officer at the desk. He took it from me without much of a reaction, but I could tell that he was taking the matter seriously. He assured me that they would investigate the contents of the bottle and let me know the results as soon as possible. It felt like a long wait, but eventually, the officer returned with some news. The bottle contained a prescription medication, but it was not one that was intended for me. They confirmed that the pill was not harmful on its own, but they needed to investigate further to determine who it belonged to and how it ended up in my bag. I was both relieved and frustrated by the outcome. On the one hand, I was glad that the pill wasn't harmful, but on the other hand, I was still left with so many unanswered questions. Who had placed the bottle in my bag and why? The mystery was far from solved, but at least I knew the pill was not dangerous. After that, the investigation into the origins of the bottle continued. The police were able to trace the medication to someone else who had accidentally dropped it in my bag at some point. It turned out to be an honest mistake, and the situation was resolved without any further complications. However, the experience left me feeling uneasy, and I couldn't shake the sense of vulnerability that had come with finding an unmarked pill bottle in my bag. I had learned a valuable lesson through this experience. Sometimes things are not as simple as they seem, and it's essential to take the time to investigate and make sure that everything is safe. It also reminded me that even in the most ordinary moments, something unexpected could happen, and it's always important to stay alert and take action when necessary. In the end, the mystery of the unmarked pill bottle was solved, but it left a lasting impression on me. I realized that I could never be too careful when it came to my health and safety, and even though the situation turned out to be harmless, I would always be more cautious in the future, paying closer attention to the small details that could have a big impact on my well-being. Story 2. A few days ago, something rather unexpected happened. A stranger reached out to me, sending a playlist that was titled Songs You'll Love. It caught me by surprise because I wasn't expecting anything like this at all. I wondered how this person knew what kind of music I liked, and whether they had some sort of psychic ability, or if it was just a lucky guess. It wasn't just the title of the playlist that intrigued me, but also the fact that the songs on it seemed so familiar. When I first hit play, I was immediately struck by the opening track. It was a song I had been humming recently, a melody that had been stuck in my head for days without knowing why. I didn't even realize how often I had been singing it until the playlist brought it to the forefront of my mind. It made me stop for a moment as I tried to remember when I had first heard the song. It felt like some sort of coincidence, a strange yet pleasant encounter between music and memory. The next track in the playlist was just as familiar. It was another song I had been hearing in my mind for a while, without knowing where it had come from. It was almost as if the person who made this playlist had been following me around, observing my thoughts and picking out the songs that had been drifting through my head. Each track seemed to echo my thoughts, creating a sense of connection between me and this anonymous stranger. It was both eerie and comforting at the same time. I began to listen more carefully to the rest of the playlist, trying to decipher the pattern. Some of the songs were ones I had heard many times before, while others were newer tracks that I had only recently come across. It made me wonder if this stranger had a deep understanding of my musical preferences, or if they had simply managed to capture a moment in time when I was particularly attuned to certain kinds of music. As I listened, I started to feel like I was part of something bigger, a shared experience between me and the mysterious person who had sent the playlist. There were moments when I felt a rush of nostalgia while listening to certain tracks. These were songs that I had forgotten about but had played a significant role in my life at some point. It was as if the playlist had a way of unlocking memories I hadn't even realized I had stored. I felt a strong sense of gratitude toward the person who had put this together, as though they had helped me reconnect with parts of myself that had been dormant for a long time. It was a strange, almost magical feeling to have music act as a bridge between past and present. One of the most interesting aspects of the playlist was how it seemed to track my emotional state. There were moments when I felt particularly down or stressed, and the songs in the playlist would match that mood. It was as if the playlist was able to adapt to my emotional needs, offering songs that resonated with my feelings in real time. I couldn't help but wonder how this stranger had managed to create such a perfect soundtrack for my life. It felt as though they were attuned to my inner world, even though we had never met. The playlist didn't just feature songs I loved, it also introduced me to new music. Some of the tracks were from artists I hadn't heard of before, but after listening to them, I found myself adding them to my own personal playlists. It was as if the stranger had been guiding me through a musical journey, expanding my horizons and introducing me to sounds I might have missed otherwise. I felt like I was learning something new with every song, as if the playlist was a map leading me to undiscovered musical treasures. As the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about the playlist and the stranger who had sent it. Who were they? And how did they know me so well? I tried to think of any clues they might have left in the playlist, but there were none. There was no message or explanation, just the music itself. It made me feel both connected and isolated, as though I was part of something larger but couldn't quite grasp the full picture. It was an intriguing mystery that I couldn't quite solve. The more I listened to the playlist, the more I began to realize how much music shapes my life. It has always been a part of me, a constant companion that helps me navigate through different emotions and experiences. The playlist made me appreciate the power of music even more, reminding me how it can connect us to our deepest feelings and memories. It was as if the songs on this playlist had been carefully selected to resonate with something inside me, speaking directly to my heart in a way that words alone could not. Each song on the playlist seemed to serve a purpose, as though it had been chosen for a specific moment in time. Some songs brought me comfort during difficult days, while others energized me when I needed a boost. There were even tracks that made me laugh, reminding me not to take life too seriously. It was as if this stranger had somehow curated a soundtrack for my life, understanding the ebb and flow of my emotions better than I did myself. It was both humbling and awe-inspiring to think about the thoughtfulness behind the playlist. I couldn't help but share the playlist with a few close friends, hoping they would experience the same connection I had felt. They too were amazed by how the songs seemed to reflect their own tastes and experiences. It was as if the stranger had cast a wide net, creating a playlist that could speak to anyone who listened to it. In that moment, I realized that music has a unique way of bringing people together, even when they don't know each other. It was a beautiful reminder of how art can transcend boundaries and create bonds that we might never have expected. The Stranger's playlist became a symbol of something greater, a reminder that there are forces at work in the world that we can't always explain. It was a beautiful mystery, and I cherished it for that reason. It made me think about how interconnected we all are, even when we don't realize it. We are all walking through life, listening to different songs, but somehow these songs can overlap, resonating with each other in ways we may never fully understand. It's a humbling thought, one that reminds me of the power of art and the ways it can shape our lives. I kept the playlist saved on my phone, listening to it whenever I needed a reminder of the strange and beautiful experience I had. It became a comfort to me, a source of joy and reflection. The music had woven itself into the fabric of my life, becoming a part of me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was no longer just a playlist from a stranger. It was a part of my own story now, a collection of songs that had touched me in ways that were difficult to put into words. Every time I listen to the playlist, I am reminded of that moment when a stranger sent me a gift of music that seemed to understand me better than I understood myself. It's a reminder of the power of connection, the way music can bridge gaps between people and bring us closer to our own hearts. It also makes me think about the potential for more moments like this in the future. Perhaps there are more strangers out there who have songs to share with me, who understand something about me that I haven't yet discovered. It's a thought that fills me with excitement and curiosity as I look forward to the next unexpected musical gift life might have in store. Story 3. One cold winter evening, as the sky darkened and the wind howled outside, I found myself finishing up a long day of work. It had been an exhausting day filled with back-to-back meetings and a mountain of paperwork to sift through. I had barely eaten anything all day, and as the clock inched closer to dinner time, my stomach growled in protest. I decided that I deserved a break and that it was time to indulge in something comforting, something familiar, something that would ease the tension in my body. For me, there was nothing better than a pizza. I had my favorite toppings picked out years ago, and no matter how many times I tried something new, I always came back to this combination. It was a simple yet perfect blend of pepperoni, mushrooms, olives, and extra cheese. Whenever I ordered, I knew exactly what I wanted, and the pizzeria staff would always get it right. There was something about the crispy crust, the gooey cheese, and the savory toppings that satisfied me in a way no other meal could. After a moment of contemplation, I reached for my phone and opened the pizza delivery app I had used countless times before. It was one of those apps where you could just tap your usual order, and everything would be set up without any need for further input. I quickly pressed the button for my regular order, double-checked the address, and confirmed that my payment details were still correct. The app informed me that the pizza would arrive in approximately 30 minutes, which was just enough time for me to get comfortable on the couch, turn on the television, and relax after the day's chaos. As I settled in with a warm blanket draped over my legs, I found myself eagerly anticipating the arrival of my pizza. I had been thinking about it for hours, and now it was just a matter of waiting. The sounds of the television filled the room, but my mind kept drifting back to the thought of that pizza, the one that would soon be in my hands. I had grown accustomed to the comforting routine of waiting for my favorite meal to arrive at my door. But this time there was something slightly different in the air. It wasn't long before I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as I jumped up to answer it. I opened the door to find a delivery person standing on my doorstep, holding a pizza box in their hands. They wore a jacket to protect themselves from the cold, and their face was obscured by a scarf. I greeted them with a smile, but there was something about the situation that felt a bit off. The delivery person didn't say a word. They simply handed me the pizza box, nodded, and turned to walk away. I stood there momentarily stunned. I hadn't expected the delivery to be so abrupt. It was as if the person had appeared out of nowhere, delivering the pizza and leaving without a trace. There was no receipt, no friendly exchange of words, and no confirmation of the payment or the order itself. I quickly looked at the box to check for any details about the order, but it was completely blank. It was as if the pizza had materialized out of thin air, with no indication of who had sent it or how they had known exactly what I wanted. Curious and a little perplexed, I carried the pizza inside and set it down on the kitchen counter. I opened the box, wondering if I had received the right order. To my surprise, it was exactly what I had been craving: pepperoni, mushrooms, olives, and extra cheese. The pizza was hot, fresh, and smelled incredible. The aroma wafted up into the air, filling the room with its mouth-watering scent. I couldn't help but smile at the sight of it. It was as if someone had read my mind and delivered exactly what I wanted. But the mystery of the delivery lingered. Who could have ordered this pizza for me, and why was there no receipt? I thought back to the moments before the delivery, trying to piece together any clues that might explain what had just happened. I hadn't told anyone about my craving for pizza, and I hadn't shared my order with anyone either. It seemed unlikely that someone had simply guessed my favorite toppings, and yet that was exactly what had occurred. It was as if the universe had conspired to fulfill my pizza desires without me even having to ask for it. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should I eat the pizza and forget about the strange delivery? Or should I try to investigate further, trying to uncover the mystery behind it all? My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a few more moments to think through the situation. Maybe there was some simple explanation, or perhaps it was just one of those odd coincidences that life sometimes throws our way. I sat down at the table with the pizza in front of me, contemplating my next move. The pizza was sitting there, tempting me with its perfect combination of flavors, but my mind was preoccupied with questions. I tried to shake off the uncertainty and focus on the food in front of me. After all, there was no harm in enjoying a meal that I didn't have to go out of my way to order. I took a bite, savoring the familiar taste and texture that had brought me so much comfort over the years. As I continued to eat, I couldn't help but think about the delivery. It had been so sudden, so unexpected, that it left me feeling a little uneasy. I wondered if someone had done this as a kind gesture, a way to brighten my evening without me even knowing it. But who would have known exactly what I liked? I didn't have any close friends or family nearby who would have taken the time to order this for me, and I hadn't mentioned my craving to anyone. The thought of a mysterious benefactor was intriguing, but it also made me feel a little uncomfortable. Eventually, I decided that I was overthinking things. It was just a pizza, after all, and nothing about it seemed harmful. The pizza was delicious, and I was enjoying it far too much to let my mind wander into paranoid territory. As the evening wore on, I pushed the mystery to the back of my mind and focused on the simple joy of enjoying my meal. After all, sometimes in life, it's best to simply let things unfold without questioning every little detail. Later that night, as I finished the last slice of pizza and prepared to go to bed, I couldn't help but smile at the oddity of the evening. It had been a strange, almost surreal experience, but in the end, it didn't matter. The pizza had been exactly what I wanted, and that was enough. Whether it was delivered by some kind soul who wanted to brighten my day or just an odd coincidence, I would never know. And perhaps that was the beauty of it sometimes. The mystery is better left unsolved. The next morning, I woke up to the usual bustle of daily life. The memory of the pizza delivery was still fresh in my mind, but I hadn't thought about it much since the night before. As I went about my morning routine, preparing for the day ahead, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever encounter such a strange occurrence again. It was one of those experiences that seemed too bizarre to be true, yet I had lived it. I went to work that day, and as the hours passed, I found myself telling a few coworkers about the strange pizza delivery. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I figured it was worth sharing. Some of them found it amusing, while others were just as puzzled as I had been. We all agreed that it was an interesting story, but none of us had any answers. No one could explain how or why it had happened, and that was part of what made it so intriguing. As time went on, I slowly forgot about the mysterious pizza delivery. It became one of those odd little memories that didn't have a clear explanation, but that didn't matter in the end. Life went on, and I continued to enjoy my pizza in peace, never once wondering if it would happen again. But every now and then, when the wind howls and the cold air creeps in, I find myself thinking back to that strange night. The pizza was exactly what I wanted, and sometimes that's all that really matters in the end. Story 4. The fire alarm went off suddenly in my apartment building, and I could hear the loud, piercing sound echoing through the halls. It was a jarring experience, especially because it seemed to only be coming from my floor. I had never heard the alarm go off in such a way before, and at first I was unsure of what was happening. The sound was unnervingly loud and persistent, and I could feel my heart rate increase as I wondered if something serious was going on. I stood up from where I was sitting and walked to the window. I could see that there were no signs of smoke or fire outside, which was somewhat reassuring. However, the alarm continued to blare, and I started to feel uneasy. It was as though the sound was invading every corner of my apartment, and it was hard to ignore. I thought to myself that I should at least investigate the situation to make sure everything was okay. I went to the hallway to see if anyone else was reacting to the alarm. The first thing I noticed was that the sound was just as loud outside my door, if not louder. There was no one else in the hallway at first, and that made me feel even more unsure of what was going on. I stood there for a moment, listening closely to see if I could hear any other sounds, like the voices of neighbors or the sound of footsteps, but it was eerily quiet apart from the alarm. After a few moments, I began to hear some movement from a few of the neighboring apartments. A couple of doors opened, and people started to step out into the hallway, looking just as confused and concerned as I felt. A few of them were in their pajamas, rubbing their eyes, as though they had just woken up from a deep sleep. It was clear that they were as uncertain as I was about whether this was a real emergency or just a malfunction of the alarm system. One of my neighbors, Mr. Johnson, who lived across the hall, appeared to be more prepared for the situation. He was already dressed and holding his phone, as though he was ready to take action. Mr. Johnson had been living in the building for years, so he likely knew how to respond to situations like this. He told us that we should all stay calm and not immediately panic, but I could tell from the look on his face that he was just as concerned as the rest of us. Another neighbor, Mrs. Harris, had her young daughter with her, and they looked a little more frantic than others. Mrs. Harris was trying to keep her daughter calm, but the child kept asking why the fire alarm was going off. It was hard to answer that question when none of us really knew the reason. Mrs. Harris looked out into the hallway, trying to see if anyone else was coming to investigate the situation. I decided to head downstairs to the building's lobby to get a better idea of what was going on. The sound of the alarm grew quieter as I descended the stairs, and it gave me a brief sense of relief. I passed a few more residents on the way down, and it seemed like everyone was just as confused as I was. I could hear some murmurs and the occasional comment about whether or not we should be evacuating the building. When I reached the lobby, I was hoping to find some answers. The building's manager, Mr. Roberts, was standing near the entrance, talking on his phone. He looked stressed and was trying to manage the situation, but it was clear that he had not yet figured out what had caused the alarm to go off. He motioned for everyone to stay calm, but no one seemed particularly reassured by his presence. I could see that he was speaking with someone on the phone about the alarm, but I was unsure if he had any concrete answers. I decided to wait for a few moments in the lobby to see if anything would change. The minutes dragged on, and the sound of the fire alarm was still faintly audible from the upper floors. Some of the residents were starting to leave, possibly to go back to their apartments, while others seemed to be lingering, uncertain about whether it was safe to go back. The tension in the room was palpable, and there was a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. At that point, I decided to call 911 to report the alarm and ask if there were any known issues with the building's fire system. I explained the situation, mentioning that the alarm seemed to be going off only on my floor, and that there was no visible sign of fire or smoke. The dispatcher on the other end of the line seemed concerned and assured me that they would send someone to check the building. They also advised me to stay outside and away from the building until help arrived. As I hung up the phone, I noticed that more residents were trickling into the lobby, probably out of concern for their safety. I felt a sense of solidarity with the others, as we all tried to figure out the best course of action. Everyone was looking to Mr. Roberts for guidance, but he seemed just as unsure as we were. It was a strange feeling to be in a situation where none of us had any answers and all we could do was wait for the authorities to arrive. Time seemed to slow down as we waited for further instructions. The longer the fire alarm blared, the more it seemed to take its toll on everyone's nerves. Some of the residents were pacing back and forth while others sat quietly, their faces etched with worry. It was strange how something as simple as a fire alarm could cause such an overwhelming sense of anxiety, but I suppose that's the effect that emergencies have on people. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a fire truck arrived in front of the building. The sound of the sirens made everyone in the lobby jump, and I could see people moving toward the entrance to get a better look. The firemen quickly set up their equipment and entered the building, ready to investigate the cause of the alarm. I watched them disappear into the building, hoping that they would have some answers soon. As I stood in the lobby, I overheard a few of the firemen speaking to Mr. Roberts. They seemed to be investigating the fire alarm system, checking the control panel to see if it had malfunctioned. Mr. Roberts was explaining that the alarm had only gone off on my floor, and it seemed like no one else in the building was affected. The firemen nodded, taking notes, and it seemed like they were making progress in identifying the problem. After a few more minutes, one of the firemen came back downstairs and addressed the gathered residents. He explained that the fire alarm had indeed malfunctioned and that there was no actual fire in the building. It seemed that a technical issue with the alarm system had triggered the false alarm on my floor. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing that we were not in any real danger. The firemen assured everyone that the situation was under control and that it was safe to return to our apartments. As the news spread, I could see the tension lifting from the faces of the other residents. People began to slowly make their way back upstairs, still talking in hushed tones about the scare. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment, realizing that I had been so quick to assume the worst when there was no fire at all. As I returned to my apartment, I could still hear the distant hum of the fire alarm system resetting. It was a strange sound, almost like a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. I sat down on my couch, grateful that everything had turned out to be a false alarm. However, the experience had left me shaken, and I knew that I would be a little more cautious the next time I heard a fire alarm going off in the building. The event had been a reminder of how important it is to stay calm during emergencies, even when the situation seems uncertain. It had also made me realize how much I depend on the people around me in times of crisis. From Mr. Johnson, who had seemed prepared and collected, to the firemen who had quickly arrived to assess the situation, I was reminded that emergencies are often less frightening when we have others to rely on. Despite the inconvenience and anxiety of the situation, I felt a sense of gratitude for the way everyone had come together to deal with the false alarm. As the hours passed and the alarm system was fully reset, the building slowly returned to normal. People went back to their routines, and the buzz of conversation that had filled the lobby began to quiet down. I was left with a sense of lingering unease, but I also knew that I had learned something important. In moments of uncertainty, it is important to stay level-headed and to trust that help will come when it is needed. The fire alarm had gone off in my building, but it had only been a brief interruption in our lives, and everything would soon return to normal. Story 5. The moment I parked my car in the lot, I felt a slight sense of unease. The day had been ordinary up to that point, with nothing particularly special or remarkable standing out. However, as I turned off the ignition and stepped out of the vehicle, something caught my attention that I couldn't quite place. There, parked right behind me, was another car with a college alumni sticker that looked oddly familiar, yet I was certain I had never seen this vehicle before. The sticker on the back of the car was unmistakable. It had the colors of my alma mater, the bold lettering of the college name, and the year of graduation clearly displayed. But I was left wondering why I had never noticed this car before. It was as if the sticker, despite its prominence, had appeared out of nowhere. I glanced at the car again, studying its make and model, trying to find any indication of its owner. The car was nothing extraordinary, just an ordinary sedan that could easily blend in with the crowd. However, the sticker on its back made it stand out to me. The feeling of familiarity continued to grow within me, yet I could not place why. There were no other distinguishing features that stood out, No bumper stickers or unique markings, just the plain logo of the Alumni Association. I walked toward the entrance of the building, still distracted by the car behind me. I tried to convince myself that it was merely a coincidence, that I was overthinking the situation. After all, the world was full of people with similar stickers, and it was possible that someone else had graduated from the same college as I did. Yet, I could not shake off the feeling that there was something more to this strange encounter. As I entered the building, I couldn't stop thinking about the car. It was almost as if the sticker was calling out to me, urging me to pay attention. My mind wandered, trying to piece together any possible connection between the car and myself. I wondered if perhaps a fellow alumni had moved into the neighborhood, or if I had somehow missed meeting them in the past. The idea that someone from my college might be nearby was a strange thought. I had been living in this area for years, but I had never once run into anyone who shared my alma mater. It was a large school, and although I had made many connections during my time there, the likelihood of seeing someone from my class was slim. Still, the sight of the sticker made me feel as if the universe was somehow trying to tell me something. I spent the rest of the day going through my normal routine, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that car. What was it doing there? And why was it parked so close to mine? Could it really be that simple? A fellow alumni simply parking in the same lot as me? Or was there something deeper at play, something more than just a coincidence? Later that afternoon, as I sat at my desk, I received a phone call from a friend I hadn't spoken to in a while. We exchanged pleasantries, catching up on each other's lives, and the conversation soon turned to our college days. We laughed about the old times, reminiscing about professors, classes, and events we had attended together. I mentioned the strange car I had seen earlier, and my friend quickly replied, "Oh, I know exactly who you're talking about." Apparently, my friend had seen the same car in the lot the previous week. They mentioned that it belonged to a former classmate who had moved back to town after several years. I couldn't believe it. It seemed that my feeling of familiarity with the car wasn't just a figment of my imagination. There was indeed a connection, and it was someone I had known long ago. As it turned out, the person driving the car was someone I had not thought about in years. We had been good friends during college, sharing classes and social events, but after graduation we had lost touch. I had never expected to cross paths with this individual again, especially not in such a random way. The coincidence of seeing their car, parked right behind mine, was almost too surreal to comprehend. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how strange and small the world truly is. The odds of running into an old college friend in such an unexpected place seemed so improbable. Yet there it was, right in front of me, a tangible reminder of the connections we make in life and how they can resurface when we least expect them. It was a humbling reminder that sometimes the people we think we have lost touch with can reappear when we need them the most. The next day, I decided to reach out to my former friend. I had not spoken to them in years, but the coincidence of seeing their car parked behind mine made me feel as if it was meant to be. I dialed the number, unsure of what to expect, but hoping that we could reconnect. When they answered, their voice was warm and familiar, and we quickly fell into conversation as if no time had passed at all. It turned out that my friend had recently moved back to town to take a new job, and they had been settling in. They explained how they had been feeling nostalgic for the old days at college and decided to put the alumni sticker on their car as a way to reconnect with those memories. They had no idea that their car would be parked behind mine, or that it would stir up so many memories for both of us. As we chatted, I realized how much time had passed since we had last spoken. It was easy to fall back into our old rhythm, reminiscing about our college years and the people we had known. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and I felt a sense of joy at reconnecting with someone who had once been such an important part of my life. It was as if the years of separation had melted away, and we were back to being the friends we once were. The whole experience was a reminder of the power of nostalgia and the lasting impact that college friendships can have. Even though we had both gone our separate ways after graduation, the memories of our time together remained strong. And now, through the strange coincidence of the car and the alumnus sticker, we had found our way back to each other. In the days that followed, My friend and I made plans to meet up and catch up in person. We hadn't seen each other in years, and it felt like the right time to reconnect and rekindle the friendship that had meant so much to both of us. The alumni sticker had served as a reminder of the bonds we had shared, and I felt grateful for the unexpected turn of events that had brought us back together. Looking back on the whole experience, I couldn't help but marvel at the strange twists and turns that life can take. The world can seem vast and disconnected, but sometimes it's the smallest moments that can bring people back together. The car parked behind mine, the sticker that seemed so familiar, and the phone call that followed all of it was a reminder that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. As I reflect on that day, I feel a sense of gratitude for the connections that have shaped my life. The friendships I made in college, even though we had lost touch, were still there, waiting to be rediscovered. The world may be large, but moments like these remind me that we are all connected in ways we may not always understand. The car parked behind me may have been a small, fleeting encounter, but it turned out to be the catalyst for something much more meaningful. Story 6. I was going through some online listings one afternoon, trying to relax and enjoy my day off, when I stumbled upon something that took me completely by surprise. As I was browsing, I came across a vacation rental website, one that I had visited in the past, but today it was different. There, on the homepage, was a listing for a property that seemed oddly familiar to me. To my shock and disbelief, it was my own house, and not just any listing, but one that included photos of the interior and exterior, all seemingly taken from angles I knew too well. The listing was not mine, and the pictures were not taken by anyone I knew. They were mine, and I had no idea how they had gotten there. I immediately clicked on the listing to take a closer look, hoping that perhaps there was some mistake. But when I opened the page, it became clear that there was no mistake at all. The photos of my living room, kitchen, and even my backyard were all there for anyone to see. The descriptions of the house, complete with details of its layout and features, were accurate, but I could not understand how this had happened. These photos had been taken by me and my family for personal use only. They had never been meant for public eyes, yet here they were, on a website advertising my home as a vacation rental. I tried to calm myself down as I processed the situation. My first instinct was to contact the website and demand that they take the listing down immediately. I started searching for a contact number, but my mind kept racing. How had these photos ended up on the website? Was someone who had previously visited my house using them without my knowledge? Or had someone else taken these photos and uploaded them with the intention of profiting from the use of my home? It was clear that I needed answers, but where to begin? After several attempts to reach someone at the website, I was finally able to get in touch with a customer service representative. She was polite but clearly confused when I explained the situation. I told her that the house in question was mine, and that I had never authorized anyone to use photos of my property in any way. She seemed surprised by this and assured me that she would investigate the matter immediately. While I appreciated her willingness to help, I still felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing that my privacy had been violated in such a blatant way. I spent the next few hours trying to piece together how this had happened. I began to suspect that perhaps someone had gained access to my photos through an online sharing platform, or perhaps even through social media. I had always been cautious about what I posted online, but I never considered the possibility that my personal photos would be used in such a way. In hindsight, I realized that I had posted several pictures of my home on social media in the past, though always with the intention of sharing moments with family and friends. Could these photos have been downloaded from there and used to create this fraudulent listing? By early afternoon, I received a call from the customer service representative. She informed me that they had taken the listing down, but the process of identifying how the photos had been obtained was still ongoing. The representative was as apologetic as she could be, but it did little to calm my growing anxiety. I couldn't help but wonder how many other people had seen my house without my knowledge. Had they even seen the personal items I kept in the photos, the little touches that made the house feel like my own? This entire experience was unsettling, and it left me questioning my online privacy and security. As the day went on, I found myself obsessing over the situation. I kept thinking about the photos of my house and the fact that someone had been using them for their own gain. What if they had rented out my house to unsuspecting vacationers? What if people had shown up at my door, expecting to stay in my home? I hadn't given anyone permission to use my property in this way, and the thought of strangers potentially invading my personal space was deeply troubling. It made me feel exposed in a way that I had never felt before. Later that evening, I decided to take a break from the situation and step outside for a bit. I took a walk around my neighborhood to clear my head. As I walked, I tried to focus on the peaceful surroundings, the quiet streets, and the familiar faces of neighbors who waved as they passed by. But even as I tried to escape the unsettling thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that my sense of security had been compromised. It was as though I was no longer in control of my own home, and that was a hard reality to face. Over the next few days, I continued to follow up with the website, hoping for more answers. They were able to confirm that the photos had been taken from my public social media profiles, and from there, they had been used to create the vacation rental listing. It was clear that someone had intentionally taken advantage of my online presence, but what I couldn't understand was why. The person who had done this was still unidentified, and the website assured me that they were doing everything they could to find out who was responsible. In the meantime, I became more vigilant about my online presence. I removed any photos of my home from social media and began to take extra precautions with my privacy settings. It was a frustrating experience, knowing that something so personal and intimate as the photos of my home had been taken and used without my consent. I had always tried to maintain a certain level of privacy online, but this experience had shown me just how vulnerable we can all be when it comes to the information we share. I found myself questioning what other personal details might be exposed without my knowledge. A week later, I received an update from the website. They had been able to trace the photos to a specific account, though the person behind it was still anonymous. The website's investigation was ongoing, but they assured me that they would be taking legal action against anyone who was found to have used my property without permission. It was somewhat comforting to know that the matter was being taken seriously, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Even if the person responsible was caught, the damage had already been done. My privacy had been violated, and I would never feel completely safe again. As time passed, I tried to move on from the experience. I took steps to protect my privacy further, including adjusting my social media settings and being more mindful of what I posted online. I also reached out to friends and family to warn them about the situation in case anyone else had been targeted in a similar way. Though I still couldn't fully shake the sense of violation, I knew that I had to find a way to move forward. My home was still my sanctuary, but I had learned a painful lesson about the importance of safeguarding my privacy in an increasingly connected world. The experience also left me wondering how many others had experienced something similar. How many people had their personal photos or information stolen and used for someone else's gain? It was a growing concern, especially as social media and online platforms continued to play such a large role in our lives. I realized that I was not alone in feeling vulnerable and exposed, but that didn't make the experience any less unsettling. In the months that followed, I became more mindful of my digital footprint. I took steps to ensure that my personal information remained private and that my photos, especially those of my home, were shared only with those I trusted. It was a small but necessary change in my approach to online life. Though I could not undo what had happened, I hoped that by taking control of my privacy, I could at least prevent anything like this from happening again. The incident also sparked a larger conversation within my community about online privacy and security. A few neighbors had heard about what happened to me and began to take a closer look at their own digital lives. We discussed the ways in which our personal information could be exposed and shared without our knowledge, and many people began to make changes to their social media settings. It was a small step toward reclaiming our privacy, but it felt good to know that I wasn't alone in taking action. Looking back, I can say that the experience was eye-opening, even though it was deeply unsettling at the time. It made me more aware of the risks that come with sharing personal information online, and it taught me to be more cautious about what I put out into the world. I still love my home, but now I take extra care to keep it to myself. No one should have the right to exploit your life for their own gain, and I've learned that the hard way. Story 7. It was early in the morning when I stepped outside my house, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The streets were quiet, with only the distant hum of early risers preparing for their day. The air was cool, a refreshing breeze brushing against my face, the calmness of the morning providing a sense of peace. I was heading to work, having planned my route carefully to avoid the morning traffic, but as I stood on the corner, I realized something I had not expected. I had missed my bus. The bus stop was deserted, with not a single person waiting for the next ride. I checked the time on my phone and saw that the next bus would not be coming for another 20 minutes. It was too long for me to wait, so I decided to call a taxi. As I dialed the number, I could feel the rush of frustration building up inside me, knowing I might be late for my first meeting of the day. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard the operator's voice on the other end, confirming that a taxi would arrive shortly. I hung up the phone and waited for the car to arrive, pacing slightly back and forth to keep myself warm in the chilly morning air. Soon enough, a yellow taxi appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver was a middle-aged man, his face partially hidden by a cap, which he took off as he greeted me. His voice was deep and warm, offering a sense of comfort that I immediately appreciated. I climbed into the back seat of the taxi, giving him a brief nod to acknowledge his greeting. The car smelled faintly of mint, with the faint scent of leather mixed in. I was in a rush, so I quickly told him my destination, or at least I thought I did. I gave him the name of my office building, but I did not provide the exact address or any further details. I figured he would know the way, and there was no need to add more information. As the taxi started moving, I settled into my seat, looking out the window as the city began to wake up. The streets were still mostly empty, and the lights from the few businesses that were open gave the world a soft, golden hue. I tried to focus on the tasks I had ahead of me, but my mind kept drifting back to the meeting. I had spent so much time preparing for this one presentation, and I was determined not to be late. The driver seemed to know exactly where he was going, as he navigated the winding streets with ease. The city was quiet, and we made our way through neighborhoods I was familiar with, but there was something strange about the way the driver was moving. He wasn't following the usual route, the one I took every day when I commuted to work. Instead, he made several turns I wasn't expecting, going down streets that weren't on my usual path. For a brief moment, I wondered if he had made a mistake, if he had misunderstood where I wanted to go. But then I reminded myself that it was early in the morning, and maybe the driver was simply trying to avoid the heavy traffic that usually built up on the main streets. I reassured myself that I would arrive at my destination soon enough, and as we moved further into the city, I relaxed again. After all, I trusted taxi drivers to know the best routes. The car hummed smoothly along the road, the sound of the engine almost hypnotic. I gazed out the window at the passing buildings, barely paying attention to the route the driver was taking. As we drove through a familiar intersection, I started to feel an odd sense of unease. It wasn't the way to my office building, yet it felt like we were heading in the right direction. It didn't make sense. The driver was still silent, not a word escaping his lips as he steered the car with practiced precision. The streets seemed quieter than usual, and the glow of streetlights grew dimmer as we moved further into the heart of the city. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The street signs, though they seemed familiar, didn't align with what I was expecting. As we approached a corner, I realized something that made my heart skip a beat. We were heading towards a neighborhood I recognized, one that was close to my house. My heart rate quickened, and a sinking feeling started to settle in my stomach. There was no way that the driver could know where I lived. I hadn't told him, I hadn't even mentioned anything about my home. I had only given him the name of my office building. I hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. Should I speak up? Should I tell him that we were going the wrong way? But something inside me told me to wait to see where this would lead. The driver didn't seem to be making any mistakes. He was driving with a purpose, as though he knew exactly where he was going. But that didn't explain why we were heading in the direction of my home. As the car rolled through familiar streets, I realized with a start that we were getting closer to my neighborhood. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. How could the driver know where I lived? I had not told him my address, and there was no way he could have guessed it. The thought made me uneasy, and I started to feel a bit trapped, unsure of what to do next. We reached the corner of my street, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The taxi slowed as it neared the entrance to my neighborhood. I could hardly believe it. This was my street, the very one I lived on. The car turned into the road and moved slowly toward my house, my heart pounding in my chest. I was completely baffled. How was this happening? I thought back to the moment I had gotten into the taxi. I had simply told the driver the name of my office building, not my home. I had never given him any indication of where I lived. But now, as the car pulled up in front of my house, I couldn't deny what was happening. The driver had somehow known where I lived, and I had no idea how or why. My mind raced to find an explanation, but none seemed to make sense. The taxi came to a stop, and the driver turned around to look at me. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had been expecting me to recognize where we were. He didn't say anything, but his eyes met mine with a knowing look, as if he were waiting for me to speak. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I was too stunned, too confused to say anything. After a long moment, I finally managed to find my voice. I asked the driver how he knew where I lived. He simply smiled and replied. He seemed like someone who would want to be close to home, so I figured this was the best place to drop you off. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. I stared at him, my mind still reeling from the strange turn of events. I thanked him, still unable to fully process what had just happened. As I got out of the taxi and made my way to the front door of my house, I glanced back at the car. The driver was already pulling away, disappearing into the early morning mist. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the whole experience. How had the driver known where I lived? How had he figured it out without me telling him? I couldn't answer those questions, and for the rest of the day, the memory of the strange taxi ride stayed with me. As I sat in my office, trying to focus on the work at hand, my mind kept drifting back to that moment. How had it happened? And was it just a coincidence, or was there something more to it? It was a mystery I couldn't solve, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew for sure was that I would never forget that ride, that quiet journey through the city that somehow brought me back home, even when I had never given the driver any indication of where that was. Story 8. It all started on a regular morning when I decided to send a simple text to a friend of mine. I had been thinking about something that had happened the day before, and I felt the need to share it. It was nothing too serious, just a few thoughts I wanted to pass along to a friend who I trusted. The message was short and straightforward, nothing that would have drawn much attention, but it felt important at the time. I typed it out quickly, using my phone as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of me. The words flowed easily, and I didn't even need to think too much about them. After sending the message, I went about my day, expecting nothing unusual to happen. It was just one of those casual exchanges that I often had with friends throughout the week. The day went by, and as I went about my errands, I completely forgot about the text. I had other things to focus on, and the thought of the message slipped out of my mind. Hours passed, and I didn't hear back from my friend, which wasn't all that strange. Sometimes people get busy, and I understood that. However, as the afternoon wore on, something unexpected happened. I received an email notification on my phone. At first I thought it was spam or a promotional message, so I almost ignored it. But something about the subject line caught my attention, and I decided to open it. To my surprise, the email was from an unknown account, and the contents of the message were almost identical to the text I had sent earlier that morning. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. How could this email have come from an unknown account? I didn't recognize the address, and I certainly hadn't sent anything to this particular email. The text within the message was word for word what I had typed earlier that morning, making the situation even more baffling. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. My first thought was that it must have been some sort of glitch, a technical error that caused a message to be sent through an email account by mistake.